Everyone on the floor, now. The words cut through the silence of the pediatric ward at St. Mary's General Hospital like a blade through fabric. Sharp, final, unmistakable. It was 2:17 in the morning when everything changed. The armed man's voice carried the kind of desperation that made seasoned professionals freeze, that made hearts stop, that made the world shrink down to a single, terrible moment where every decision mattered and time moved like cold honey. Three nurses hit the floor immediately. Their training kicked in. Their survival instincts screamed, "Get down! Stay down! Wait for help!" But Sarah Brennan didn't drop. She didn't panic. She didn't even look particularly scared. Instead, the 36-year-old night nurse, who everyone at St. Mary's considered reliable but unremarkable, simply turned from the medication cart she'd been organizing. Her tired blue eyes swept the dimly lit hallway with the kind of assessment that most people reserve for checking the weather. Calculating, measuring, processing information at a speed that didn't match her exhausted appearance. Her colleagues would later say they'd never seen that expression on her face before. Not in 8 years of working together. Not during codes when children stopped breathing. Not during trauma situations when parents collapsed. Not even during the chaos of flu season when the ward became a battlefield of its own kind. This was different. This was something else entirely. Sarah stood between the gunman and the children's rooms, with her hands visible and her posture oddly relaxed for someone facing the barrel of a weapon. The fluorescent safety lights cast shadows across her face that made her look younger and older at the same time. Made her look like someone who'd seen this movie before and already knew how it ended. What happened in the next 12 minutes would reveal that the exhausted night nurse everyone overlooked was actually Master Sergeant Sarah Brennan, former 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, skills that could neutralize threats most people couldn't even imagine. But in that moment, standing in the pediatric ward hallway with a gunman 10 feet away and 12 sleeping children behind her, Sarah was just doing what she'd always done. Protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who Sarah Brennan was before anyone knew her name. She'd been working the night shift at St. Mary's for 8 years. Started in 2018 when she was 28 years old, fresh out of nursing school, carrying a resume that listed previous experience as medical technician, U.S. Army. Nothing more, nothing less. Just enough truth to pass background checks without inviting questions she didn't want to answer. At 36, she looked like every other experienced nurse who'd logged too many double shifts. Comfortable shoes worn thin from walking miles of hospital corridors every week. Scrubs that had been washed so many times the fabric was soft as old cotton. Hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that she never bothered to style. No makeup. No jewelry except a simple watch with a second hand for taking pulses. The kind of woman you'd walk past in a grocery store and never notice. The kind of professional you'd trust with your sick child, but never invite to dinner parties. Reliable, competent, unremarkable. That's what her colleagues saw. That's what her personnel file said. That's what 8 years of careful anonymity had built. But there were signs, small ones, the kind that only certain people noticed. Sarah always volunteered for the hardest shifts, the ones where the sickest children needed the most attention, the ones where other nurses burned out or requested transfers. She never complained about difficult patients or demanding families, never seemed rattled by emergencies that sent younger staff into panic mode. When codes were called and children stopped breathing, Sarah moved with surgical precision. Her voice stayed steady and commanding in a way that seemed natural, but somehow different. She anticipated problems before they materialized, positioned equipment before it was needed, made decisions with a speed and certainty that didn't match her mild-mannered reputation. Dr. Rebecca Harrington, the 29-year-old pediatric resident who'd been working with Sarah for 2 years, once commented to a colleague that Nurse Brennan handled trauma situations like someone who'd been trained for war. She meant it as a compliment. She had no idea how accurate it was. The night shift in the pediatric ward was usually quiet. Sarah preferred it that way. She could focus on her young patients without the chaos of daytime operations. No visitors crowding the hallways, no administrative demands pulling her attention in 17 directions, no doctors making rounds and asking questions she didn't want to answer. Just her and the children who needed her. Tonight she was caring for 12 patients. A premature infant in an incubator fighting to grow lungs strong enough to breathe. Twin 7-year-olds recovering from appendectomies. A 10-year-old with pneumonia. A 5-year-old named Emma Callahan, who'd been admitted 3 days ago with injuries that had triggered a mandatory Child Protective Services investigation. Emma was sleeping when Sarah checked on her at 2:10 a.m. The little girl looked peaceful for the first time since admission. Her blonde hair spread across the pillow like spilled sunlight, her breathing steady and even. The bruises on her arms starting to fade from purple to yellow-green. Sarah adjusted the girl's blanket with hands that had performed this gentle ritual thousands of times. Checked the IV line, made a note on the chart, moved on to the next room. 7 minutes later, everything changed. Pete Thornton had been the head of security at St. Mary's for 15 years. Before that, he'd been a Marine. Gulf War, 1991. Came home with a service record he rarely discussed and a way of reading people that most civilians never developed. At 62 years old, Pete was the kind of man who noticed things, details that other people missed, patterns that didn't fit, professionals pretending to be something they weren't. He'd been watching Sarah Brennan for 8 years, not in a suspicious way, not in a threatening way, in the way one veteran recognizes another, even when they're wearing different uniforms, even when they're pretending to be someone else entirely. Pete saw it in how she moved through the hospital, the way she scanned rooms before entering, how she positioned herself near exits during conversations, the unconscious threat assessments she made when strangers approached the pediatric ward, the muscle memory that showed in crisis situations when her training overwhelmed her carefully constructed civilian persona. Marines recognized Rangers the same way old soldiers recognized each other in crowded rooms. Something in the eyes, something in the posture, something that came from places where people learned hard lessons about staying alive. Pete never said anything, never asked questions, never pushed. He figured Sarah Brennan had her reasons for hiding whatever she'd been before she became Nurse Brennan. He figured those reasons were her business. He figured when she was ready to show people who she really was, she'd do it on her own terms. He just didn't expect those terms to involve an armed intruder and 12 sleeping children. Pete was doing his rounds on the 3rd floor when he heard the commotion over his radio. Pediatric ward, possible situation, all units respond. He moved faster than a 62-year-old man should be able to move. Sarah heard the footsteps before she saw the man. It was 2:15 a.m. She was at the nurse's station updating charts. The only sounds in the ward were the soft beeping of monitors and the whisper of ventilation systems pushing air through the building's lungs. Then footsteps. In the hallway. Moving with purpose, but trying to be quiet. In 8 years at St. Mary's, Sarah had learned the sound of every type of footstep in the hospital. Doctors rushing to emergencies wore urgency like cologne. Security guards on rounds walked with steady rhythm. Anxious family members paced with irregular patterns that betrayed their emotional state. These footsteps were different. They belonged to someone who didn't want to be noticed, but was moving with tactical awareness. Someone who knew how to stay quiet, but couldn't entirely suppress the training that made them check corners and clear angles. Sarah's hands stopped moving on the keyboard. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes focused in a way that would have surprised anyone who knew Nurse Brennan, the mild-mannered caregiver. She stood and moved to the edge of the nurse's station, positioned herself where she could see down the corridor without being immediately visible. The pediatric ward was dimly lit at night, with only safety lighting and the glow from computer screens. Long shadows stretched across tile floors. The hallway looked like something from a dream. Quiet, surreal, wrong. At the far end of the corridor, maybe 40 feet away, Sarah saw a figure, tall, male, late 30s, wearing dark clothing that wasn't a uniform, but wasn't exactly civilian either. The kind of tactical casual that people wore when they wanted to move fast, but didn't want to advertise it. He was checking door handles, room by room, looking for something, someone. Sarah's training from another life kicked in immediately. Automatic, unstoppable. 8 years of civilian nursing vanished like morning fog. She scanned for exits, counted potential civilians in the area, assessed the threat level with a kind of cold efficiency that came from doing this in places where mistakes got people killed. The man was carrying something in his right hand, something that caught the dim light in a way that made Sarah's blood temperature drop 10 degrees. A handgun. The assessment took 3 seconds. The decision took 1. Sarah was already moving when Dr. Rebecca Harrington appeared at the opposite end of the hallway. The young resident was reviewing charts on a tablet, walking with the distracted focus of someone who'd been awake for 18 hours and had 6 more to go. Completely unaware of the armed man now 30 feet in front of her and closing. Sarah had maybe 5 seconds before Dr. Harrington walked directly into a situation that could end very badly. Her voice cut through the silence like a command from someone who'd given commands in places where hesitation meant death. Dr. Harrington, I need you in room 312, now, medical emergency. The tone carried authority that Nurse Brennan had never used before. Not in 8 years. Not once. It was the voice of someone who expected to be obeyed immediately, without question or discussion. Dr. Harrington's head snapped up. She looked confused but recognized the urgency in Sarah's voice. Changed direction, moved quickly toward room 312, moved away from the armed man. The intruder heard Sarah's voice and turned in their direction. For a moment, the three of them formed a triangle in the dim hallway. Dr. Harrington approaching Sarah, Sarah standing protectively in front of the children's rooms. The gunman now focusing his attention on both women. His hand tightened on the weapon. Sarah's expression didn't change. "You," the man said. His voice shook. His pupils were dilated. His stance indicated some firearms training, but not professional level. "Are you the charge nurse?" "I'm the nurse on duty," Sarah replied. Her voice was calm, steady, the kind of calm that people in law enforcement call tactical calm, the kind that comes from managing situations where one wrong word detonates everything. "What do you need?" The man took 2 steps forward. His weapon was pointed at the floor but could come up in half a second. Sarah tracked it with peripheral vision while maintaining eye contact with the intruder. Behind her, she heard Dr. Harrington's sharp intake of breath. The young resident had just realized there was no emergency in room 312, had just figured out she'd been maneuvered away from danger, was now standing frozen in the hallway trying to process what was happening. "I need to see my daughter," the man said. His voice cracked on the word daughter. Real emotion, real pain. Whatever was driving him, it wasn't simple violence. That made him more dangerous, not less. Desperation was harder to predict than aggression. "They won't let me see her. Emma Callahan. She's 5 years old. She's sick, and they're keeping her from me." Sarah recognized the name immediately. Emma Callahan, 5 years old, admitted 3 days ago with injuries that suggested possible abuse. Father banned from hospital premises pending CPS investigation. Security notified. Restraining order filed. The man in front of her was Derek Callahan, Emma's father. Desperate, armed, clearly using something that was making him unstable. Standing in a pediatric ward at 2:17 in the morning with a weapon and nothing left to lose. Sarah made her second tactical assessment in 30 seconds. Derek Callahan wasn't a trained operator, wasn't military or law enforcement. His grip on the weapon was shaky, but determined. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool hospital air. He was coming down from something, probably methamphetamine, probably hadn't slept in days. That made him a bomb with a timer nobody could see. "Sir," Sarah said. Her voice took on a different quality, softer but more authoritative. The tone she'd perfected during hostage negotiations in places most Americans only saw on news broadcasts. I understand you're worried about Emma. Derek's attention focused on her completely. Let me help you see her. But first, I need you to put the weapon down so we can talk. No. Derek's hand came up. The gun pointed at Sarah, then swung toward Dr. Harrington, then back to Sarah. No more talking. Everyone keeps talking. Everyone keeps lying to me. They say I hurt her. They say I'm a bad father. But I didn't. I love her. I just want to see my little girl. Dr. Harrington made a small sound. Fear. Recognition that this situation was very real and very dangerous. But Sarah noticed something else. Derek Callahan's hand was trembling. Not from fear, from withdrawal. The gun wavered. His trigger discipline was poor. His emotional state was deteriorating rapidly. He was escalating toward violence, but didn't want to be. That gave her a window. What's your name? Sarah asked. She took a small step forward, just 6 inches, testing, measuring his reaction. Derek Callahan. And I know what you people think of me. I know what the reports say. But I didn't hurt her. I would never hurt Emma. Sarah's combat experience told her that Derek was moving toward a breaking point. Her medical training recognized a man in genuine emotional crisis. The combination of drug withdrawal, desperation, and access to a weapon made him incredibly dangerous. But there was still humanity there, still a father who loved his daughter, still someone who could be reached if she said the right words. Derek, Sarah said, I can see that you love Emma very much. It was a lie, but it was a strategic lie, the kind she'd learned in military interrogations. Establish common ground, build connection, create space for de-escalation before everything goes lethal. Derek's expression shifted. Something in his face softened for half a second. She has? His voice caught. What did she say? She asked when Daddy was coming to visit. Another lie. But this one landed. Derek's whole body language changed. The gun lowered slightly. His breathing steadied for 3 seconds. Sarah saw her opening. But Derek, if you want to see Emma, we need to handle this the right way. Hospital security is already on the way. If they see you with that gun, this is going to end badly for everyone, especially for Emma. I don't care about security. Derek's voice rose. The gun came back up. I don't care about any of you. I just want my daughter. She needs me. She's scared and she needs her daddy, and you people won't let me see her. There are sick children here, Dr. Harrington said. Her voice shook, but she was trying. Whatever your problem is, we can solve it without... Shut up. Derek swung the weapon toward Dr. Harrington, and Sarah Brennan moved. What happened next took 4 seconds. To the people watching, it looked like violence. Fast, brutal, overwhelming. To Sarah, it felt like coming home. She stepped forward and to the side in one fluid motion, closed the distance between herself and Derek Callahan while simultaneously moving off the weapon's line of fire. Her left hand shot out and grabbed Derek's right wrist. Not gentle, not tentative, a grip that came from years of hand-to-hand combat training, hard enough to shock, controlled enough to manipulate. In the same motion, she drove the heel of her right hand into Derek's elbow joint. The strike was precise, surgical, designed to cause maximum pain and temporarily disable the arm without causing permanent damage. The gun fired once. The sound was deafening in the enclosed hallway. The bullet punched into the ceiling tiles. Acoustic material and dust rained down on the floor, but Derek's grip loosened from the pain shooting through his arm. Sarah continued her motion, pivoted around Derek's body while maintaining control of his weapon arm. Her training had taught her that disarmament was about momentum and leverage, not strength. About using an opponent's own body against them. About moving through techniques so fast that resistance became impossible. She twisted Derek's wrist in a direction it wasn't designed to go. The gun fell from his hand and clattered on the tile floor. Sarah kicked it away, 20 feet down the hallway, out of reach. Then she drove her knee into Derek Callahan's solar plexus. He doubled over, gasping, all the air driven from his lungs, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and the sudden understanding that he'd made a terrible mistake. Sarah completed the technique by sweeping Derek's legs and guiding his fall to the floor. He landed face down. She pinned his arm behind his back in a control position that was simultaneously painful and completely secure. Her knee pressed into his spine. Her hand controlled his head. He couldn't move, couldn't fight, could barely breathe. The entire disarmament sequence took 4 seconds from start to finish. 4 seconds to go from armed intruder to controlled suspect. 4 seconds to reveal that Nurse Sarah Brennan was something else entirely. Dr. Rebecca Harrington stood frozen against the hallway wall, her mouth open, her eyes wide, staring at her colleague like she was seeing her for the first time. Because she was. "Dr. Harrington," Sarah said. Her voice was steady, not elevated, not stressed. The voice of someone who'd just done something routine and unremarkable instead of something most people couldn't imagine doing. "Please call security and let them know the situation is contained. Also, we'll need to check the children for any trauma from the gunshot." The bullet went into the ceiling, but the sound may have frightened them. "How?" Dr. Harrington's voice came out as a whisper. "How did you—" What Sarah said next changed everything. "I had some training before I became a nurse." Within 5 minutes, the pediatric ward was swarming with hospital security, Denver Police Department officers, and paramedics responding to the report of shots fired. Derek Callahan was taken into custody, handcuffed, read his rights, led away by officers who handled him with the kind of caution reserved for people who'd already demonstrated they were dangerous. The weapon was secured as evidence. Photographs were taken of the scene. Statements were collected from the 3 nurses who dropped to the floor when Derek entered the ward. But all eyes kept returning to Sarah Brennan. She stood near the nurses' station with her arms crossed, blood on her scrubs from where she'd controlled Derek. Her face composed, her breathing normal, looking tired and unremarkable again, except for something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Something that made even the police officers approach her with unexpected respect. "Ma'am," said a plainclothes detective who'd arrived on scene. "Detective James Crawford, Denver PD. I need to get your statement about what happened here." Sarah nodded, but she was already mentally preparing for questions she'd hoped never to answer. Questions that would unravel 8 years of careful civilian construction. "Before we start," Crawford continued, "I have to ask, where did you learn to disarm someone like that? That was some serious training." The detective was in his mid-40s, fit, military bearing, the kind of cop who'd seen combat before he wore a badge. He recognized what Sarah had done because he'd been trained to do similar things. Sarah looked around at the faces staring at her. Dr. Harrington, who'd worked beside her for 2 years. Security guards who'd waved hello every night for 8 years. Nurses who'd shared coffee breaks and complained about hospital politics. Police officers who saw her as a witness. Hospital administrators who were already worried about liability. They were all waiting for an answer that would explain how their quiet, tired colleague had just performed a textbook military disarmament technique. "I had some training before I became a nurse," Sarah repeated. "What kind of training?" Crawford pressed. Sarah took a breath. This was the moment, the crossroads, the place where her 2 lives met and one of them had to give way. "Military training. What branch?" "Army." Crawford's expression shifted. Recognition. Respect. He was asking questions he already knew the answers to. Testing. Confirming. "What was your MOS?" 11B, Sarah replied. Anyone with military experience would recognize the designation. Infantry. Combat soldier. The foundation of every army since men first picked up weapons. Crawford's eyebrows went up. "Infantry. You were a grunt, among other things. Dr. Harrington looked confused. What does that mean? Crawford answered for Sarah without taking his eyes off her. It means she was a combat soldier. But that still doesn't explain. He looked back at Sarah, the question in his eyes. What unit? Sarah realized there was no point in hiding it anymore. No point in protecting the secret she'd carried for 8 years. Derek Callahan had forced her hand, made her show who she really was. The truth was out. Now she just had to own it. 75th Ranger Regiment. The silence that followed was absolute. Even people without military experience had heard of the Rangers. They were legendary special operations soldiers, among the most elite fighters in the United States military. The people who did things in dark places that never made the news. The tip of the spear, the first ones in and the last ones out. Rangers? Dr. Harrington's voice was barely audible. Like actual Army Rangers? Yes. Crawford was staring at Sarah with an expression that combined respect and something close to awe. How many deployments? 3. Afghanistan, 2011, 2013, 2015. Rank when you got out? Master Sergeant. Dr. Harrington's mouth fell open. You were a Master Sergeant in the Rangers? But you're a nurse. You take care of sick children. Sarah turned to face her colleague. When she spoke, her voice carried weight that Nurse Brennan had never used before. Dr. Harrington, being a Ranger doesn't mean you stop caring about people. It means you're willing to do whatever it takes to protect them. One of the security guards spoke up, Pete Thornton, the 62-year-old former Marine who'd been watching Sarah for 8 years, who'd recognized her from the beginning but never said anything. Sergeant Brennan, Pete said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. In all the time I've known you, you never mentioned military service. Sarah met his eyes, saw understanding there, recognition, the acknowledgement between two people who'd served in different uniforms but fought the same fights. Because it wasn't relevant to taking care of patients, Sarah said. My job here is to help children get better, not to talk about my time in combat. Detective Crawford was still processing everything. Master Sergeant Brennan, with your background, you could have killed that man in about 10 different ways. Why did you choose to just disarm him? Sarah looked down the hallway toward Emma Callahan's room. The little girl who'd slept through everything, who needed her father to get help, not to die in a hospital corridor. Because he's a father who's scared and confused, and his daughter needs him to get help, not to become a statistic. Taking a life should always be the last option, not the first. Dr. Harrington shook her head slowly, like she was trying to recalibrate everything she thought she knew about the person she'd worked beside for 2 years. How many people know about your military service at this hospital? Sarah's voice was quiet. You're the first. But why keep it secret? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made everyone listening understand exactly why she'd hidden for 8 years. Because when people find out you're a ranger, especially a female ranger, they start looking at you differently. They either think you're some kind of superhero who can solve any problem with violence, or they think you're damaged goods who can't function in normal society. I didn't want to be either of those things. I just wanted to be a nurse. But you saved lives tonight, Dr. Harrington pointed out. I save lives every night, usually with medication and medical procedures, not with hand-to-hand combat. Tonight was unusual. Crawford finished taking his notes. Ma'am, I have to say, your actions tonight prevented what could have been a tragedy. That man was unstable and armed. You handled the situation perfectly. Sarah nodded, but she looked tired in a way that went beyond working a long shift. There's going to be paperwork, investigations, probably media attention. Are you prepared for that? Sarah sighed. I suppose I don't have a choice now. But the biggest revelation was still coming, because Pete Thornton stepped forward with something in his eyes that Sarah recognized. The look of one warrior acknowledging another. The moment when pretense fell away and truth stood naked in fluorescent hospital lighting. Master Sergeant Brennan, Pete said formally. Marines recognize Rangers. I've known what you were from the first week you worked here. Sarah stared at him. 8 years? You knew for 8 years? Pete nodded. Gulf War, 1991. I saw enough combat to know what it looks like when someone's trying to forget it. Figured you had your reasons for hiding. Figured those reasons were your business. Why didn't you say anything? Because you weren't ready. Pete smiled slightly. But you are now. Welcome back to the fight, Sergeant, even if this one's fought in a different uniform. Sarah felt something shift inside her, something that had been locked away for 8 years. Not gone, never gone, just waiting. This isn't a fight, she said quietly. Pete's expression was knowing. Everything's a fight, Sarah. You know that better than anyone. You just found a different way to wage war. Against disease instead of enemies. With healing instead of killing. But make no mistake, it's still war. And tonight proved you never stopped being a warrior. Sarah looked around at all the faces watching her. Colleagues who would never see her the same way again. A secret that had protected her for 8 years, now shattered beyond repair. A life she'd built carefully around the core of who she really was, now exposed. She'd thought she left the war behind when she took off the uniform. Tonight proved that some wars never end. They just change shape. Part 2. The sun rose over Denver 3 hours after Sarah Brennan's secret died in a pediatric ward hallway. She sat in a small conference room on the hospital's administrative floor, watching the morning light paint shadows across walls she'd walked past for 8 years without ever entering. This was where decisions got made, where policies were written, where careers were built or destroyed with signatures on paper and conversations behind closed doors. Sarah had spent 8 years successfully avoiding this room. Now she couldn't leave. Hospital Administrator James Walsh entered at 6:47 a.m., carrying a manila folder and an expression that Sarah recognized from her military days. The look of someone who just discovered a problem they didn't know existed and weren't sure how to solve. Walsh was 52 years old, silver hair cut precisely, expensive suit that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month. The kind of administrator who measured success in budget reports and patient satisfaction scores, who treated hospitals like businesses and staff like assets to be managed. He sat across from Sarah without offering coffee or pleasantries. Nurse Brennan, he said. His voice carried the weight of authority and irritation in equal measure. I've been reviewing your personnel file. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She'd known this was coming. Known the moment she disarmed Derek Callahan that her carefully constructed civilian identity would crumble under scrutiny. According to your employment application from 8 years ago, Walsh continued, you listed your previous experience as medical technician, U.S. Army. Is that accurate? It's not inaccurate, Sarah replied carefully, but it's not complete either, is it? Detective Crawford was still in the building. He'd spent the last 3 hours processing the scene and taking statements. Now he leaned against the conference room wall with his arms crossed, watching, listening, providing silent support that Sarah appreciated more than she could express. Mr. Walsh, Crawford said quietly, Miss Brennan has been fully cooperative with our investigation. She neutralized a dangerous threat and likely saved lives tonight. I'm not questioning her actions, Walsh said. His attention never left Sarah. I'm questioning why a master sergeant in the 75th Ranger Regiment applied for a nursing position under the job title medical technician. Dr. Harrington was also present. She'd refused to go home after her shift ended, refused to leave Sarah to face this alone. Now she sat beside Sarah with exhausted loyalty in her eyes. She never lied on any forms, Dr. Harrington pointed out. She was a medical technician in the Army. That part is true. But she was also a lot more than that, Walsh said. He opened the folder and read from documents that Sarah hadn't seen in years. According to the records I pulled from the Department of Defense, Master Sergeant Sarah Brennan was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device, the Purple Heart, the Army Commendation Medal, multiple campaign medals, 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan between 2010 and 2016. The small conference room felt suddenly smaller. You served as a Ranger medic, Walsh continued, which means you were responsible for keeping special operations soldiers alive in some of the most dangerous combat zones in the world. You were involved in multiple direct action missions, provided medical support during counterterrorism operations, were wounded twice in combat. He looked up from the papers, and somehow none of this made it into your job interview 8 years ago. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Mr. Walsh, when I applied for this position, I was looking for a chance to use my medical skills to help people without anyone shooting at me. I wanted to heal children, not talk about wars I'd been in. But Sarah, Dr. Harrington interjected. Her voice carried genuine confusion. Your experience could have been valuable here. We could have learned from you. Sarah turned to face her colleague, the young doctor who meant well but didn't understand, who'd never seen what Sarah had seen, never done what Sarah had done. Learned what, Rebecca? How to start an IV while under mortar fire? How to perform emergency surgery in a building with no roof? How to keep someone alive when half their blood is soaking into Afghan soil? The conference room went quiet. Sarah's voice had taken on an edge that none of them had heard before. Even Pete Thornton, standing by the door with his security guard uniform and his Marine bearing, looked at her with new understanding. I came here, Sarah continued, because I wanted to save lives in a place where children get better, not where they... She stopped herself, took a breath, forced her voice back to neutral. I came here to be a nurse, not a soldier. Detective Crawford spoke into the silence. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what happened over there that made you want to leave all that behind? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Outside the conference room windows, Denver was waking up. People driving to work, living normal lives, never thinking about the things that happened in dark places so they could sleep safely. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was softer, more honest than she'd been in years. There was a mission in 2015. We were providing medical support for a village that had been hit by insurgents. There were children, injured children who needed help. She paused. The memories were sharp even after all these years. I spent 18 hours straight working on kids who'd been hurt in an attack on their school. Some of them didn't make it. Despite everything we tried, despite all our training and equipment and determination, some of them just didn't make it. Dr. Harrington's expression softened with understanding. When I got back to base that night, Sarah continued, I realized something. I realized I wanted to spend the rest of my life in a place where children go to get better, not where they go to die. So when my enlistment was up in 2016, I used my GI Bill benefits to get my nursing degree, and I found the quietest pediatric ward I could find. Walsh looked at the faces around him, his staff members who were seeing their colleague in an entirely new light, his carefully managed hospital suddenly complicated by a warrior who'd been hiding in plain sight for 8 years. Sarah, he said, why didn't you tell us any of this before tonight? Because it wasn't about me. Sarah's voice was steady. It was about the patients. And until tonight, my past wasn't relevant to taking care of sick children. Walsh closed the folder. I need to discuss this with the board of directors. There will be questions about liability, about disclosure, about whether your military background should have been more thoroughly documented. Sarah nodded. She'd expected this, expected consequences for the violence that had saved lives but disrupted the careful order of hospital operations. In the meantime, Walsh continued, you're on administrative leave pending investigation. The words hit like a physical blow. 8 years of perfect service. 8 years of saving lives and working double shifts and being the nurse everyone could count on. Erased in 4 seconds of combat efficiency. Mr. Walsh, Dr. Harrington stood up. Her voice shook with anger. Sarah saved lives tonight. She stopped an armed intruder. She protected patients. And you're suspending her? It's protocol, Walsh said, but his tone suggested he wasn't comfortable with the decision. Anytime there's a violent incident involving staff, we have to investigate. Detective Crawford pushed off the wall. For the record, my investigation shows that Ms. Brennan acted appropriately given the circumstances. She used minimal, necessary force to neutralize a threat. If anything, she showed remarkable restraint. Walsh nodded but stood to leave. The decision was made. The bureaucracy was in motion. Sarah Brennan would be processed and evaluated, and probably cleared eventually. But the message was clear. Warriors weren't supposed to hide among the healers. The door closed behind Walsh with a sound like finality. Sarah sat in the conference room with the sunrise painting everything gold and felt the weight of 8 years settling on her shoulders. She'd tried to leave the war behind, tried to build something different, tried to prove that she could be more than the violence she'd learned. Tonight had proven otherwise. Pete Thornton walked over and sat in the chair Walsh had vacated. The old Marine looked at the young Ranger with eyes that had seen too much and understood even more. "Sergeant Brennan," he said quietly, "you did the right thing." "Did I?" Sarah's voice was tired. "I just lost my job for doing what I was trained to do." "You didn't lose anything." Pete's voice carried certainty. "You revealed something. There's a difference." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock on the conference room door. Detective Crawford opened it. There was a man standing in the hallway, disheveled, exhausted, hands cuffed in front of him with an officer on each side. Derek Callahan. He looked smaller than he had with a gun. More human, more broken. "Crawford, what is this?" Sarah stood up. "Mr. Callahan asked to speak with you," Crawford said. "I thought you should hear what he has to say." Derek Callahan looked at Sarah with eyes that carried desperation and something else. Something that looked like hope. "I need to tell you the truth," Derek said. His voice cracked. "About Emma, about what really happened." Sarah exchanged glances with Pete and Dr. Harrington. This wasn't protocol, wasn't proper procedure, but something in Derek's expression made her pause. "I'm listening," she said. Derek took a shaky breath. "They're lying about me. The hospital, CPS, all of them. They say I abused Emma, that I hurt my little girl. But I didn't. I swear on everything I love, I didn't." "Then what happened?" Crawford asked, his detective voice, neutral, gathering information. "Emma was here for a procedure 3 weeks ago." Derek's words came fast, tumbling over each other. "A minor surgery, routine. But something went wrong. They hurt her during the procedure, and instead of admitting it, instead of telling us the truth, they blamed me." Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. "What kind of procedure?" "Appendectomy." Derek's voice shook. "She was supposed to be in and out, simple. But she came out with bruises, nerve damage in her arm, pain she never had before. And when we asked questions, when we demanded answers, suddenly CPS was involved. Suddenly I was under investigation. Suddenly I couldn't see my daughter." Dr. Harrington stepped forward. "Mr. Callahan, that's a serious accusation." "It's the truth." Derek looked at each of them. "I'm not a good man. I know that. I've made mistakes. I've used drugs. I've done things I'm ashamed of. But I never hurt Emma. Never. She's the only good thing in my life." Detective Crawford made notes. "You're saying the hospital covered up a medical error by blaming you?" "Yes." Derek's voice broke. "And I didn't know what to do. Nobody would listen. Nobody would believe me. So I did something stupid. I got desperate. I thought if I could just see her, just talk to her, she could tell everyone I never hurt her." Sarah's mind was racing, processing, analyzing. Her combat training had taught her to recognize when someone was lying, to read body language and vocal patterns, to separate truth from deception. Derek Callahan was telling the truth, or at least he believed he was telling the truth. "Detective Crawford," Sarah said quietly, "I need to see Emma Callahan's medical file." Crawford looked at her. That's not really your case anymore, Ms. Brennan. You're on administrative leave. Then I need to see it as a concerned citizen, Sarah said. Something in her voice carried command. Because if what Mr. Callahan is saying is true, there's a 5-year-old girl upstairs whose medical records have been falsified to cover up negligence. Crawford considered this, then nodded. I'll need to get a warrant, but given the circumstances, I think a judge will be sympathetic. Derek looked at Sarah with desperate gratitude. You believe me? I believe you deserve someone looking into your claims objectively, Sarah said. That's all I can promise right now. That's more than anyone else has done. Derek's voice was barely a whisper. Thank you. The officers led him away, back to custody, back to charges that might be justified or might be the result of a hospital protecting itself. Sarah stood in the conference room watching the sunrise complete its work across the Denver skyline. 8 years she'd worked in this hospital. 8 years she'd trusted the system. 8 years she'd believed that civilians did things differently than the military. That corruption was something that happened in war zones, not pediatric wards. Maybe she'd been wrong. Pete Thornton stood beside her. His voice was quiet, but firm. Sergeant Brennan, he said, you know what you have to do. Sarah looked at the old Marine. What's that? Fight. Pete's expression was knowing. You left the Rangers because command covered up mistakes instead of owning them. Because powerful people protected themselves instead of the innocent. You thought you could escape that by becoming a nurse. He paused. But corruption doesn't care what uniform you wear. It follows you. It finds you. It forces you to choose between being a warrior or being a victim. Sarah felt something shift inside her, something that had been dormant for 8 years, something that Derek Callahan's desperation had awakened. I'm on administrative leave, she said. I can't investigate anything officially. Pete smiled. Good thing I'm head of security then. I can investigate whatever I want. And I could use a consultant with medical expertise. That's not how this works. It is now. Pete's voice carried the weight of someone who'd made a decision. You spent 8 years hiding from who you are, Sarah. Tonight you remembered. Now you have a choice. You can go home and wait for Walsh to decide your fate. Or you can do what Rangers do. Which is? Complete the mission. Pete looked toward the pediatric ward. There's a 5-year-old girl upstairs who might be the victim of medical malpractice, covered up by people who care more about liability than truth. She needs someone to fight for her. Someone who knows what it looks like when powerful people lie to protect themselves. Dr. Harrington joined them. I'm in, she said. If Emma's records were falsified, I want to know. I've been treating that child based on false information. That's not just wrong. It's dangerous. Crawford pocketed his notebook. I'll get that warrant. Should have it by this afternoon. In the meantime, maybe you three should do some preliminary research, just to make sure there's something worth investigating. He said it with the tone of someone who was officially discouraging unauthorized investigation, while unofficially encouraging exactly that. Sarah looked at the 3 people standing with her, a former Marine security guard, a young doctor who barely knew her, a detective who was willing to bend rules for truth. 8 years ago, she'd taken off a uniform and thought she was done fighting. Tonight, she realized some fights find you whether you want them or not. All right, Sarah said, let's look at Emma's file. 2 hours later, Sarah sat in Pete's security office, staring at medical records that made her blood run cold. Dr. Harrington sat beside her, pointing at documentation with hands that shook slightly. This doesn't make sense, Rebecca said. Emma's preoperative assessment shows no abnormalities. Standard appendectomy procedure. But her post-operative notes describe injuries consistent with... She trailed off. Sarah finished the thought. Consistent with surgical complications, not abuse. Rebecca nodded. These bruises, the pattern, they're along the nerve pathways where retractors would have been placed during surgery. And this nerve damage in her arm? That's exactly where IV lines and monitoring equipment would have been positioned. Sarah studied the photographs in Emma's file. She'd seen thousands of injuries in her career: combat wounds, training accidents, medical complications. She knew the difference between intentional harm and procedural error. Emma Callahan hadn't been abused by her father. She'd been injured during surgery. Pete leaned over their shoulders. So Derek was telling the truth. It looks that way, Sarah said. But the question is, why would the hospital cover it up? Rebecca flipped through more pages. Look at this. The original surgical notes were written by Dr. Michael Brenner. He documented several complications during the procedure: equipment failure, unexpected bleeding, difficulty with positioning. She turned to the next page. But 3 days later, an amended report was filed, signed by Walsh and the head of surgery. The amended version removes all mention of complications and adds notes about suspicious injuries consistent with abuse. Sarah felt anger rising, cold, controlled. The kind of anger that came from seeing people in power protect themselves at the expense of the powerless. They rewrote history, she said quietly, just like Command did in Afghanistan. Pete's expression was grim. How bad was the original error? Based on these notes, Rebecca's voice was professional, but Sarah could hear the fury underneath. Bad enough that Emma will probably need additional surgery to correct the nerve damage. Bad enough that Derek Callahan would have grounds for a significant malpractice lawsuit. Bad enough, Sarah added, that it could cost the hospital millions of dollars and destroy several careers. So they blamed the father, Pete said. Easier to villainize a drug addict than admitting your surgeons made mistakes. Sarah stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the hospital complex sprawled across city blocks. Thousands of patients, hundreds of staff, all trusting that the people in charge were making decisions based on medicine and ethics, not liability and money. I thought I left this behind, Sarah said quietly. When I left the military, I thought civilian institutions were different. I thought the corruption was something that happened in war zones when people were scared and desperate. Pete moved to stand beside her, the old Marine who'd seen his own share of institutional betrayal. Corruption happens anywhere humans have power, he said. Military, civilian, government, corporate, doesn't matter. When people care more about protecting themselves than protecting the truth, they become the enemy. He paused. You left the Rangers because you were tired of Command covering up friendly fire. Tired of watching innocent people suffer while powerful people avoided consequences. But you didn't stop being a Ranger, Sarah. You just tried to fight a different kind of war. Sarah looked at him. What kind? The kind where you save people instead of killing them, where you heal instead of hurt. Pete's voice was certain. But make no mistake, it's still war. And tonight you remembered you're still a warrior. Rebecca joined them at the window. So what do? We have evidence of falsified medical records. We have a father in custody based on false accusations. We have a little girl who needs corrective surgery. But we're a nurse on administrative leave, a security guard, and a resident with no authority. Sarah felt something clicking into place, the same feeling she used to get before missions in Afghanistan, when all the pieces of a plan aligned and she could see the path forward. We document everything, she said. Every discrepancy in Emma's records, every timeline inconsistency, every signature on falsified reports. Pete nodded. I can pull security footage from the night of Emma's surgery, see who accessed her files afterward. I can request peer review of the surgical procedure, Rebecca added. Frame it as quality assurance. That's within my authority as a resident. And I can make sure Detective Crawford has everything he needs for his investigation, Sarah finished. When he gets that warrant this afternoon, we hand him a case so clear that Walsh can't talk his way out of it. The three of them stood together in Pete's office planning their attack. Different branches of service, different generations, different specialties, but united by the same principle that had defined Sarah's entire career. Protect those who can't protect themselves. By early afternoon, they had built a case that would have made any prosecutor smile. Security footage showing Walsh and the head of surgery accessing Emma's medical records at 11 p.m. on the night of her procedure. Original surgical notes backed up on the hospital server before they were amended. Testimony from 2 nurses who'd been pressured to sign amended reports. Financial records showing the hospital's malpractice insurance had already settled 3 similar cases in the past 2 years. The picture was clear. The hospital had a pattern of covering up surgical errors by blaming patients and families. Emma Callahan wasn't the first victim. She was just the latest. Detective Crawford arrived at 2 p.m. with his warrant. He took one look at the evidence Sarah's team had compiled and actually smiled. "Miss Brennan," he said, "you would have made a hell of a detective." "I already was," Sarah replied, "just in a different context." Crawford's expression turned serious. "This is enough to open a criminal investigation. Falsifying medical records is a felony. If Walsh and his staff knowingly filed false reports with CPS, that's obstruction. If they pressured witnesses, that's intimidation. If they did this to protect themselves from liability, that's fraud." He paused. "You just took down a hospital administrator." "We took down a corrupt system," Pete corrected. "Walsh was just the face of it." Sarah sat in Pete's office chair, feeling exhaustion settle into her bones. She'd been awake for almost 24 hours, had disarmed a gunman, had her identity exposed, had her career put on hold, had investigated and exposed a conspiracy in her own workplace. She'd done more in one night than most people did in a year, and she wasn't done yet. "Detective Crawford," Sarah said, "what happens to Derek Callahan?" Crawford consulted his notes. "Given what we now know, the assault charges will probably be reduced. The district attorney will take into account that he was acting under extreme emotional distress based on false information. He'll face consequences for bringing a weapon into a hospital and discharging a firearm. But this changes the context significantly. And Emma?" Crawford's expression softened. "She'll get the medical care she actually needs. And her father will probably be there when she wakes up from surgery." Sarah nodded. That was something. Not enough to undo the damage. Not enough to give Derek back the weeks he'd missed with his daughter. But something. Rebecca sat down next to Sarah. "There's something I don't understand," she said. "How did you know? How did you know Derek was telling the truth when everyone else believed he was guilty?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she told them a story she'd never told anyone at St. Mary's. A story from 2015. A story that explained why she'd left the military and what she'd been running from. "We were in a village outside Kandahar," Sarah began, "supporting a local unit. There was an incident, civilians killed. The official report said they were insurgents, that we'd come under fire and responded appropriately." Her voice was steady, but Pete could hear the weight underneath. "But I was there. I treated the wounded. I saw the bodies. They weren't insurgents. They were farmers. Wrong place, wrong time. Killed by friendly fire that command refused to acknowledge because it was easier to call them enemies than to admit we'd made a mistake." Dr. Harrington's expression was horrified. "What did you do?" "I filed a report," Sarah said. "Documented what I'd seen. Insisted on an investigation. And you know what happened? Nothing. Command buried the report, pressured witnesses, changed the narrative, protected themselves." She looked at Rebecca. "That's when I learned what corruption looks like. It looks like powerful people protecting themselves while innocent people suffer. It looks like paperwork that gets amended, and witnesses who get intimidated, and truth that gets buried under layers of institutional protection." "And that's what you saw in Emma's case," Pete said. "You recognize the pattern." Sarah nodded. "When Derek told me his story, I heard echoes of every civilian who'd tried to tell me the truth, while command told me to trust the official version. So yes, I believed him, because I've seen what it looks like when institutions lie." The office was quiet for a long moment. Then Pete spoke. "That's why you really left, isn't it? Not just because of the school tragedy, because you couldn't fight for a command that cared more about covering mistakes than preventing them." Sarah met his eyes. I was tired of powerful people protecting themselves instead of the innocent. I thought I could escape it by becoming a nurse. I thought healing was cleaner than fighting. Was it? Crawford asked. Sarah laughed. It was bitter and honest. No, because corruption isn't about what uniform you wear or what profession you choose. It's about what you do when you discover it, whether you look away or whether you fight. She stood up, straightened her scrubs, looked at the three people who'd helped her expose the truth. For 8 years I looked away, Sarah said. I told myself I was done fighting, that I'd left that life behind. But tonight, Derek Callahan forced me to remember something important. What's that? Rebecca asked. Sarah's voice carried the weight of conviction. Some fights find you whether you're looking for them or not. And when they do, you have two choices. You can pretend you're not a warrior anymore, or you can pick up your weapons and complete the mission. Pete smiled. What's the mission, Sergeant? Sarah looked toward the pediatric ward, where Emma Callahan was sleeping, where 12 other children needed protecting, where corruption had flourished because nobody was willing to fight it. The mission is the same as it's always been, Sarah said. Protect those who can't protect themselves. No matter who the enemy is, no matter what uniform I'm wearing. She turned to face them. And right now, the enemy is a hospital administration that thinks covering up mistakes is more important than taking care of patients. So we're going to war, the right way this time. Pete Thornton looked at the young ranger with pride in his eyes. The old Marine who'd been waiting 8 years for this moment, waiting for Sarah Brennan to stop hiding and start fighting. Welcome back to the battlefield, Sergeant, he said. Different terrain, same mission. Let's go to work. Outside Pete's office, the hospital continued its daily operations. Doctors made rounds, nurses changed shifts, patients recovered or didn't. The machinery of modern medicine ground forward with brutal efficiency. But in a small security office on the 3rd floor, 3 people were planning an operation that would expose corruption at the highest levels of St. Mary's General Hospital. And at the center of it all was a 36-year-old woman who'd spent 8 years trying to forget she was a warrior. Tonight she'd remembered, and God help anyone who stood between Master Sergeant Sarah Brennan and the truth. Part 3. James Walsh arrived at Pete Thornton's security office at 4:37 p.m. with 2 members of the hospital's legal team and an expression that could freeze water. The afternoon sun slanted through windows, turning the small office into something that felt less like a workspace and more like an interrogation room. Sarah stood near Pete's desk with her arms crossed. Dr. Rebecca Harrington sat in a chair with medical files spread across her lap. Detective Crawford leaned against the wall with his badge visible and his notepad ready. They'd been waiting for this confrontation, preparing for it, building their case with the kind of methodical precision that Sarah had learned in a different life. Walsh stopped in the doorway. His expensive suit looked rumpled. His usually perfect hair showed signs of stress. He'd spent the afternoon dealing with Detective Crawford's warrant and the questions that came with it. Now he was here to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spinning away from him. Nurse Brennan, Walsh said. His voice carried authority, but Sarah heard the uncertainty underneath. I need to speak with you about your future at this hospital. Sarah didn't move. I thought I was on administrative leave pending investigation. That investigation has been expedited. Walsh stepped into the office. His lawyers flanked him like bodyguards. Given the circumstances of last night's incident and the subsequent complications that have arisen, the board of directors has asked me to inform you that your employment at St. Mary's General Hospital is terminated effective immediately. The words landed like ordnance in a quiet room. Dr. Harrington stood up. Her voice shook with anger. You're firing her? For stopping an armed intruder? For saving lives? This is not about her actions last night, Walsh said, though his tone suggested otherwise. This is about a pattern of behavior inconsistent with hospital policy. Nurse Brennan failed to disclose relevant information during her employment screening. She engaged in unauthorized investigation of protected medical records. She has created a hostile work environment through her confrontational approach to hospital administration. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. The same feeling she used to get before combat, when the enemy showed themselves and all the planning came down to execution. "Mr. Walsh," she said quietly, "are you really going to stand there and pretend this is about my employment screening?" Walsh's expression hardened. "I don't know what you're implying. I'm implying that you're firing me because I discovered you've been falsifying medical records to cover up surgical errors." Sarah's voice was steady, calm, the kind of calm that came from absolute certainty. "I'm implying that you're more concerned about protecting yourself from liability than protecting patients from negligence." "Those are serious accusations," one of the lawyers said, "and completely unfounded." Detective Crawford pushed off the wall. "Actually," he said, "they're extremely well-founded. I have a warrant to seize Emma Callahan's medical records, original and amended versions. I have security footage showing Mr. Walsh accessing those records at unusual hours. I have testimony from nurses who were pressured to sign false reports." He smiled without warmth. "And I have enough evidence to open a criminal investigation into systematic fraud at this hospital. So maybe, before you fire Ms. Brennan, you should worry about whether you'll be keeping your own job, or your freedom." Walsh's face went pale. "This is ridiculous. You're taking the word of a desperate drug addict over hospital administration." "We're taking the word of medical evidence," Rebecca said. She held up Emma's file. "The injury patterns don't match abuse. They match surgical complications. Any qualified physician can see that. The question is why you chose to hide it. Because acknowledging it would have cost millions in malpractice claims," Pete Thornton said. The old Marine stepped forward. "And this isn't the first time, is it, Mr. Walsh? I've been head of security here for 15 years. I've watched you and your staff cover up 3 similar cases in the past 2 years alone." The room went silent. Walsh stared at Pete with something close to betrayal in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Pete opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick folder. "3 years ago, I started noticing patterns. Medical errors that got blamed on patients or families. Surgical complications that disappeared from official records. Staff members who asked questions suddenly finding themselves transferred or terminated." He set the folder on the desk. "So I started documenting everything. Every amended report, every unusual file access, every conversation I overheard when people thought security wasn't paying attention. I've been building a case for 3 years, Mr. Walsh, waiting for someone brave enough to fight." He looked at Sarah. Then Sergeant Brennan showed up, and I realized I'd found my warrior. Walsh's composure cracked completely. "You've been spying on hospital operations? That's a violation of trust, a betrayal of your position." "No," Pete said. His voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "What you've been doing is a betrayal of patients, of families, of every principle that medicine is supposed to stand for. I've been doing my job, which is protecting people, even if that means protecting them from you." One of the lawyers stepped forward. "This is all irrelevant. The hospital board has made its decision regarding Ms. Brennan's employment. Nothing you've said changes that." Sarah looked at the 3 men standing in Pete's office trying to regain control of a situation they'd already lost. For 8 years she'd worked quietly, followed rules, stayed invisible, convinced herself that civilian institutions were different from military command, that corruption was something that happened in war zones, not hospitals. Derek Callahan had taught her otherwise, and now she was done pretending. "Mr. Walsh," Sarah said, "you can fire me, you can threaten me, you can try to discredit everything we found, but that little girl upstairs deserves the truth. Her father deserves justice, and every family that trusts you with their children's lives deserves to know that you care more about covering mistakes than preventing them." She stepped forward. "I spent 3 years fighting in Afghanistan. I watched command cover up friendly fire. I watched powerful people protect themselves while innocent civilians suffered. I left the military because I was tired of that corruption, tired of watching institutions betray the people they were supposed to serve. Her voice carried steel underneath. I came here thinking I could escape it, thinking healing was cleaner than fighting. But you taught me something important today, Mr. Walsh. It's about choices. And when good people discover corruption, they have two options: look away or fight back. She held his gaze. I'm done looking away. Walsh's face flushed red. You're making a terrible mistake, Nurse Brennan. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The hospital's legal team will destroy you. Your nursing license will be revoked. Your military record will be scrutinized. By the time we're done, you won't be able to find work anywhere in healthcare. Sarah smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who'd faced worse threats in darker places and survived. Mr. Walsh, she said quietly, I've been shot at by people who actually knew how to fight. Your lawyers don't scare me. The confrontation was interrupted by Sarah's radio, the one she'd forgotten she was still wearing from her night shift. It crackled to life with urgent voices and medical codes that made every healthcare professional in the room freeze. Code Blue, Pediatric Ward, Room 318. Code Blue, Pediatric Ward, Room 318. Dr. Harrington's face went white. That's Tommy Henderson, 8 years old, post-operative day 2 from cardiac surgery. She was already moving toward the door, Sarah right behind her. Pete grabbed his security radio. Crawford followed with the trained instinct of someone who recognized when situations escalated beyond bureaucracy into life and death. Walsh and his lawyers stood in the office looking suddenly irrelevant, because whatever legal maneuvering they'd planned didn't matter when a child was dying 3 floors above them. Sarah ran through hospital corridors with muscle memory guiding her feet. She knew these hallways, knew every turn and door and shortcut, had walked them for 8 years in comfortable shoes and quiet anonymity. Now she ran them like she used to run toward gunfire in Afghanistan, toward the sound of people who needed help, toward the place where her training mattered more than politics or policy. Room 318 was chaos. A young nurse Sarah recognized was performing chest compressions on an 8-year-old boy. Tommy Henderson, red-haired kid with freckles across his nose, and a medical chart that showed complex cardiac surgery 2 days ago. He'd been recovering well, stable vitals, normal post-operative course, until 3 minutes ago when his heart stopped. Dr. Harrington burst into the room and immediately took charge. She was young, but she was good. Started calling orders with the kind of authority that came from training and adrenaline. Continue compressions. I need epinephrine. Get the crash cart. Someone page cardiothoracic surgery. Sarah moved to the other side of the bed, her hands already reaching for IV access, already checking monitor leads, already performing the 1,000 small assessments that separated living patients from dead ones. She worked with Dr. Harrington in perfect synchronization. They'd done this before, during night shifts, during emergencies when there was no time for hierarchy or formality, just 2 medical professionals trying to keep someone alive. But something was wrong. Sarah's combat-trained instincts recognized it immediately, the same way she used to recognize improvised explosive devices in Afghan villages, the same way she learned to see patterns that didn't fit. Rebecca, Sarah said quietly while they worked, look at his IV site. Dr. Harrington glanced at the boy's arm while another nurse took over compressions. The IV insertion point was red, swollen, showing signs of infiltration. The line's blown, Rebecca said. That could compromise medication delivery. Sarah checked the IV pump, looked at the fluid bag, looked at the tubing connections, and saw exactly what had happened. The IV had infiltrated hours ago, probably overnight. The nursing staff had been too busy to notice, too understaffed to catch it. The medications Tommy needed to keep his heart stable after surgery had been going into his tissue instead of his bloodstream. This wasn't just a medical emergency. This was negligence. the same kind of systematic understaffing and corner cutting that Pete had been documenting for 3 years. The same kind of institutional failure that prioritized profit over patient safety. And Sarah was watching a child die because of it. Her training took over. Not her nursing training, her ranger training. The skills she'd learned in places where medical supplies were limited and time was measured in heartbeats. And keeping someone alive meant improvising with whatever resources existed. "Rebecca," Sarah said. Her voice carried command. "Stop compressions. I need to establish new IV access. Central line. Femoral approach." Dr. Harrington looked at her. Central line placement wasn't standard nursing procedure. Required physician oversight. Required sterile technique in time they didn't have. But Rebecca saw something in Sarah's eyes. Recognition. Trust. The understanding that sometimes you had to break protocol to save lives. "Do it," Rebecca said. Sarah moved with precision that came from performing this procedure in combat, under fire, in vehicles and bomb buildings, in places where sterile technique was a luxury, and saving lives meant working fast and accurate. She positioned Tommy, prepped the site, found the femoral vein with hands that had done this hundreds of times, inserted the catheter with surgical precision, secured the line, connected new IV tubing, 30 seconds from start to finish. The room was silent except for monitor alarms and controlled breathing. "Resume compressions," Sarah said. "Push epi through the new line." The medication hit Tommy's bloodstream directly. No infiltration, no delays. Pure pharmaceutical intervention delivered exactly where it needed to go. 15 seconds later, Tommy's heart rhythm changed on the monitor. 30 seconds later, he had a pulse. 45 seconds later, he was breathing on his own. Dr. Harrington sagged against the wall, her hands shaking from adrenaline and relief, and the reality of how close they'd come to losing an 8-year-old boy. But Sarah wasn't done. While the medical team stabilized Tommy, Sarah moved around the room with purpose. She photographed the infiltrated IV site, documented the pump settings, checked the timestamps on medication administration records, pulled the IV fluid bag and tubing as evidence. Detective Crawford stood in the doorway, watching. He recognized what Sarah was doing because he'd done similar things at crime scenes. Gathering evidence, building a case, creating an irrefutable record of what had happened. Pete Thornton appeared beside him. The old Marine looked at Sarah working and saw exactly what he'd known was there for 8 years. A warrior who'd never stopped fighting, just changed battlefields. Rebecca approached Sarah when Tommy was stable and transferred to the ICU. Her voice was shaking, but her eyes were clear. "What was that?" she asked. "That central line placement. That wasn't standard protocol." "No," Sarah said. "It was combat medicine. Field expedient procedures when time matters more than policy." She held up the evidence she'd collected. "And this is proof that Tommy almost died because of the same negligence that hurt Emma Callahan. Understaffing, poor oversight, equipment failures that get ignored because fixing them costs money." Rebecca looked at the IV supplies, then at Sarah, then at the room where a child had almost died. "How many more?" she asked quietly. "How many more children are at risk because Walsh cares more about profit margins than patient safety?" Sarah's expression was hard. "That's what we're going to find out." By 6 p.m., Detective Crawford had enough evidence to expand his investigation from Emma Callahan's falsified records to systematic patient care violations throughout St. Mary's General Hospital. Pete's 3 years of documentation, combined with Sarah's medical expertise and Rebecca's physician testimony, created a case that even Walsh's expensive lawyers couldn't dismiss. The state medical board was notified. Federal health inspectors were called. The hospital's board of directors convened emergency meetings, and James Walsh found himself facing not just termination, but potential criminal charges for fraud, obstruction, and reckless endangerment. Sarah sat in Pete's office at 8 p.m., watching the sunset paint Denver in shades of gold and red. She'd been awake for almost 40 hours, had fought more battles in one day than most people fought in years, had exposed corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for years, and she'd just been fired from a job she'd held for 8 years. Detective Crawford entered with coffee and news. Walsh has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The board voted unanimously. He'll likely face charges within the week. Good, Pete said. What about Derek Callahan? Crawford smiled. District attorney agreed to drop the assault charges in exchange for guilty plea to illegal possession of a firearm. Time served. He'll be released tomorrow morning, just in time to see Emma before her corrective surgery. Sarah felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. That was justice. Imperfect, but real. A father reunited with his daughter. A little girl getting the medical care she actually needed. What about Miss Brennan? Rebecca asked. She's still terminated. Walsh's last official act before suspension. Crawford's expression turned serious. That's more complicated. Hospital board wants to avoid further scandal. They're offering reinstatement with back pay if she agrees not to pursue legal action. Sarah shook her head. I don't want my job back. Not under those conditions. Not at a hospital that fires people for telling the truth and only reverses course when they get caught. Then what do you want? Pete asked. Sarah looked at the old Marine who'd been watching her for 8 years, waiting for her to stop hiding, waiting for her to remember who she was. I want to build something different, she said. Something that helps people like me, combat veterans who come home with medical training and trauma and no idea how to transition back to civilian life. People who know how to save lives under impossible conditions, but don't know how to function in normal hospitals. She stood up, looked out the window at the city below. I want to create a program that takes those veterans and helps them become nurses, medics, respiratory therapists, healthcare professionals who understand that healing can be just as important as fighting. Pete smiled. That's a good mission, Sergeant. You'll need help executing it. Are you volunteering? Sarah asked. Pete nodded. Marines know something about transitions too, and I'm tired of watching good people get chewed up by corrupt systems. Time to build something better. Rebecca raised her hand. I'm in. You taught me more about emergency medicine in one night than I learned in 4 years of medical school. If you're training veterans, you'll need physician oversight. Might as well be someone who's seen you work. Crawford closed his notebook. I'll help navigate the bureaucracy, connect you with veteran organizations, make sure you have the legal framework to operate. Sarah looked at the 3 people who'd stood with her, who'd fought beside her, who'd helped her expose corruption and protect patients, and remember that she'd never stopped being a warrior, just changed how she fought. All right, she said, let's build something worth fighting for. 6 months later, Sarah Brennan stood in a classroom at the University of Colorado, Denver, watching 15 military veterans file in for the first day of their accelerated nursing program. They were young, most of them in their 20s and early 30s, fresh out of the service with combat deployments and medical training and the kind of lost expression that Sarah recognized from her own mirror 8 years ago. They'd been Army medics and Navy corpsmen and Air Force pararescue specialists. They'd saved lives in deserts and mountains and places most Americans only saw on news broadcasts. They'd come home to a country that thanked them for their service, but didn't know what to do with people trained to heal under fire. Now they were here, in Sarah's program. The Veterans Healthcare Transition Initiative at St. Mary's General Hospital, the program that had been created from the ashes of James Walsh's corruption, the program that Sarah directed and Pete Thornton co-directed, and Dr. Rebecca Harrington provided medical oversight for. The program, funded by settlement money from Walsh's prosecution and supported by veteran organizations across Colorado. Pete stood at the back of the classroom in his security uniform, still working at St. Mary's, still protecting people, but now also mentoring young veterans who needed someone who understood what they'd been through. Sarah waited for the students to settle, watched them scan the room, check exits, assess threats, all the unconscious behaviors that came from serving in places where relaxing meant dying. She knew those behaviors, had spent 8 years trying to suppress them. 6 months ago, she'd learned to embrace them instead. "Good morning," Sarah said. Her voice carried authority, command, the tone of someone who'd earned respect in hard places. "My name is Sarah Brennan. I'm a former Master Sergeant in the 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, 8 years as a civilian nurse." She paused. "6 months ago, I stopped an armed intruder in a pediatric ward. Exposed systematic corruption at this hospital, got fired and reinstated in the same week, and realized something important. The veterans were watching her with attention, recognition, understanding. I realized that leaving the military doesn't mean you stop being a warrior," Sarah continued. "It just means you find different battles to fight, different ways to protect people, different methods of completing the mission." She walked to the center of the room. "You're here because you have skills most healthcare professionals will never develop. You can make life and death decisions in seconds. You can work under impossible pressure. You can keep people alive when everything's going wrong and there's no backup coming." Her voice was strong. "But you're also here because you're tired of fighting enemies you can see, tired of treating wounds caused by violence, tired of watching people die when you've done everything right and it still wasn't enough." Several veterans nodded. Sarah saw recognition in their eyes. "This program will teach you how to channel those skills into healing instead of fighting, how to treat disease instead of combat wounds, how to work in hospitals instead of battlefields. But make no mistake, it's still war, just against different enemies." She gestured to the hospital complex visible through classroom windows. "Your enemies now are illness and negligence and institutional corruption. Your mission is protecting patients who can't protect themselves. Your weapons are knowledge and compassion and the refusal to compromise on patient care." Pete spoke from the back of the room. His voice carried the authority of a Marine who'd fought his own battles. "You're going to face people who think veterans can't transition to civilian healthcare, who think combat training makes you too aggressive, or too traumatized, or too different to work with regular people." He walked forward. "You're going to prove them wrong. The same way Sergeant Brennan proved them wrong. The same way every veteran in this room has proven wrong everyone who doubted you." Sarah nodded. "This program is 12 months, accelerated, intense, designed for people who know how to learn fast and work hard. You'll get your nursing degrees, clinical experience, placement assistance at hospitals across Colorado." She paused. "But more importantly, you'll get support from people who understand what you've been through, who know what it's like to come home from war and try to build something different, who recognize that healing can be just as powerful as fighting." One of the students raised his hand, young, maybe 25, Army patch on his backpack, combat infantry badge on his jacket. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carried uncertainty, "I was a medic in Kandahar, lost 3 patients on my last deployment. Good men who deserve to live. I'm here because I want to save lives instead of watching people die, but I don't know if I'm cut out for this, if I'm too broken to heal others." Sarah walked over to him, looked him in the eyes, saw the same doubt she'd carried for years. "What's your name?" she asked. "Corporal Michael Stevens, ma'am." "Listen to me, Michael," Sarah said. Her voice was firm but kind. "You're not broken. You're experienced. There's a difference. You watch people die despite your best efforts. That doesn't make you a failure. It makes you someone who understands that healing isn't always enough, that sometimes you do everything right and still lose." She crouched to his level. "That knowledge makes you a better healthcare provider, not worse, because you'll never take recovery for granted. You'll never assume treatments will work. You'll fight for every patient with everything you have because you know how precious life is and how fast it can disappear." Michael's eyes were wet. "Thank you, ma'am." Sarah stood, addressed the whole room. "Every person here has trauma, has losses, has moments they wish they could redo. That's not weakness. That's the price of serving in places where the stakes were life and death, and the margin for error was zero. Her voice carried conviction. This program will help you transform that trauma into strength, those losses into motivation, those moments into wisdom you can pass to patients who need someone who understands suffering. Pete added from the back, "You're warriors, always will be. We're just teaching you to wage war against disease instead of enemies, to fight with compassion instead of weapons, to protect civilians not from bullets, but from the failures of healthcare systems that don't always put patients first." Sarah returned to the front of the room. "Over the next 12 months, you're going to learn more than medical procedures and pharmacology. You're going to learn how to be the kind of healthcare professional that patients need, the kind who doesn't quit when things get hard, who doesn't compromise when administrators prioritize money over care, who remembers that healing is a mission, not just a job." She looked at each student. "You're going to become nurses who carry the warrior ethos into civilian medicine, who understand that protecting the vulnerable is the same mission whether you're in Kandahar or a hospital ward, who know that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons." The classroom was silent, attentive, understanding. Sarah felt something settle in her chest. Purpose, direction, the sense that all the violence she'd learned and all the trauma she'd survived and all the years she'd spent hiding had led to this moment, training the next generation of warrior healers. "Welcome to the Veterans Healthcare Transition Initiative," Sarah said. "You're about to discover that leaving the military doesn't mean you stop serving. It just means you find new ways to complete the mission." Pete smiled from the back of the room. "And that mission is the same as it's always been," he added. "Protect those who can't protect themselves, no matter what uniform you wear, no matter what battlefield you're on." Sarah looked at Pete, at Rebecca standing in the doorway, at the 15 veterans ready to transform combat experience into healing power, at the hospital complex where she'd hidden for 8 years before learning to fight again. "Class dismissed," she said. "See you tomorrow morning. 0600 hours. Don't be late." The veterans filed out with purpose, direction, hope. Sarah stood in the empty classroom watching sunset paint Denver in colors that reminded her of Afghanistan. Gold and red and purple. Beautiful and terrible at the same time. Pete approached. "How are you feeling, Sergeant?" Sarah smiled. It was genuine this time. No bitterness, no regret. "Like I finally figured out what I've been fighting for," she said. "Not against enemies or insurgents or corrupt administrators, but for something bigger, for the idea that warriors don't stop serving when they take off the uniform. They just find new battles worth fighting." Pete nodded. "That's the real mission. Always has been. Everything else is just tactics." Rebecca joined them. "You're going to change lives with this program. Those kids are going to become incredible nurses because they learn from someone who refused to compromise." Sarah looked at her two partners. The Marine who'd recognized her from the beginning, the doctor who'd stood beside her when everything fell apart, the people who'd helped her remember that healing could be a form of warfare, that protecting patients was just as important as protecting soldiers, that the warrior ethos didn't disappear when you traded combat boots for comfortable shoes. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, "for not letting me hide, for helping me fight, for reminding me that some battles find you whether you're looking for them or not." Pete smiled. "That's what warriors do. We watch each other's backs, even when the battlefield changes." They stood together watching the sunset complete its work. 3 people who'd fought corruption and exposed truth and built something meaningful from the ashes of institutional failure. Somewhere in St. Mary's General Hospital, Emma Callahan was recovering from corrective surgery with her father at her bedside. Tommy Henderson was laughing with his family after his cardiac crisis. Derek Callahan was rebuilding his life with his daughter safe in his arms. and 15 military veterans were preparing to become the kind of nurses who understood that healing was a mission worth fighting for. Sarah Brennan had spent 8 years trying to forget she was a warrior. 6 months ago, she'd remembered. Now she was teaching others that the greatest battles aren't always fought with weapons, that the most important victories aren't always measured in enemies defeated, that warriors who choose to heal instead of hurt carry a power that violence can never match. The power to protect life instead of ending it. The power to build instead of destroy. The power to prove that leaving the battlefield doesn't mean abandoning the fight. It just means finding better reasons to keep fighting. Sarah walked out of the classroom with Pete and Rebecca beside her. Tomorrow she'd train veterans. Next week she'd testify at Walsh's criminal trial. Next month she'd expand her program to include more students. But tonight she was simply a warrior who'd found her purpose. Protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. One patient at a time. One veteran at a time. One life at a time. The mission never changed. Only the methods evolved. And Master Sergeant Sarah Brennan was finally home.